Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, the first session of the UN General Assembly for this year, of course, wrapped up in New York. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but we thought we'd spend a little bit of time today talking about the takeaways from this whole thing. And, what happened, who said what, and what's going to happen going forward. And certainly we want to concentrate on the Canadian perspective because our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, was front and center in an awful lot of the discussions that were going on some of the key issues, which is not something that usually happens at the United Nations, but that, I think, speaks to the character of Carney and the reputation that he has with other world leaders. Well, talked about that in the past. We're going to mention that just again. I would hope that the takeaway here is going to be about some ongoing work that can be done and laying the foundation for world peace, or at least stopping some of these conflicts instead of the Trump thing. I mean, the 55-minute diatribe that's often incoherent that Trump went on with was basically, I think in hindsight, we can look at it and simply say he was simply playing to his base. He was not addressing, he was in front of the United Nations, but he was talking to his MAGA base in the United States because it was the same BS, the same rhetoric that he's done. It's his stump speech, basically. The world is against us and everything's wrong except if it comes from me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to buy that. I mean, they buy everything he says, hook, line, and sinker. The United Nations folks, not so much. But after his long speech, which included threats, accusations, most of them, of course, untrue, and the assertion, of course, that he was being sabotaged. And we're talking about the escalator incident and the teleprompter incident, and Trump was quite upset about that. So that's all I got out of the United Nations, a bad escalator and the teleprompter thing. As a matter of fact, his press secretary, who we've talked about in the past, questionable intelligence there, said that it was a conspiracy. They were just trying to embarrass Trump. Well, it turns out, by the way, just as a quick aside, that the stalled escalator was done by one of Trump's people, backing up, the videographer trying to find him and Melania coming up the escalator, and he hit the stop button. And the teleprompter is run by the White House staff, even at the United Nations. I don't know if Trump knew that. I don't know if Trump knows a whole lot of anything, but it was his own people that screwed up, not the United Nations. There was no conspiracy theory, but it played pretty well on Fox TV that night, of course, because they just love to again, feed the beast here. Anything these people think that the world is against us, and the far left and the Democrats or whoever they want to target these days is causing all the grief in the world and all the grief to the White House. And those people just lap it up. Once again, we found out that none of that's true. But what was interesting, though, is one of the big takeaways, of course, was Trump's about face on Ukraine. And, you juxtapose that with that now famous White House scene when Zelensky was sitting there and Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice president, attacked Zelensky, basically, and basically said, you got to give up. That's all there is to it. And Trump going on a couple of months ago about how Russia was going to keep all the land that they'd won in the war. Well, total opposite. Yesterday at the United Nations, not in front of the General Assembly, but in some of the discussions he was having afterwards, where he actually said he thought that Ukraine should keep fighting and could win the war and win all the land back that they've lost so far. That's totally contradictory to what Trump has been saying in the past. Why? Well, I don't know if he's necessarily seen the light on this. It has probably more to do with the fact that he's pissed off at Vladimir Putin because Putin is embarrassing him. And when Trump said ceasefire, he didn't. He's still, of course, contending with his major offensive in Ukraine. The Russian incursions into NATO airspace in a couple of different countries, the drones and the fighter jets, etc., is an embarrassment. And I guess Trump, he's having a little hissy fit right now. So I don't know how long-lasting it is. I don't know how strong that commitment is to Ukraine. I'd like to think that maybe finally Trump is seeing the error of his ways and is going to move and be the supportive individual with NATO and with the G7 towards Ukraine that most people were expecting from the United States. We'll see. As we know, he changes his mind on a whim, as so many of people have said, the experts have said, and we've talked about here on the podcast. Trump's policies oftentimes are in basically the result of the last person he talked to. So we don't know. I mean, as we do the podcast today, he seems to be 110% fully in support of Ukraine. That could change. That could change by tomorrow. We just don't know. But it was a positive sign. As to the rest of the stuff Trump has said, well, I take everything he says with the grain of salt, because if there's one thing that we've come to know from Trump, especially in the dealings he's had with Canada over the last little while, you just can't trust him. You can't trust anything he says as a commitment, anything he says as a promise. He will just arbitrarily change his mind and impose his will for two reasons. First of all, because he can get away with it. There are no checks and balances in the U.S. political system right now. Nobody in the Congress, in the Senate, or in the House of Representatives has the backbone to stand up to him. And certainly the Supreme Court backs him up on just about everything. And he knows this. So he's going to say and do whatever he wants. And he isn't even supposed to be dealing with tariffs, as we've talked about. But nobody in the States wants to do anything about that, so he's going to continue with his ridiculous ways. And that's an interesting point, because that whole idea of tariffs, and maybe even more tariffs, came up yesterday, and it had to do with Canada's announcement, of course, that they will be recognized the Palestinian state. And Prime Minister Carney talked about that, of course, in his address to the General Assembly, and reiterated that in a couple of the other sessions that he was on. We have always maintained that's the right thing to do. This is not a new idea, not a new policy. The idea of a two-state solution goes all the way back to 1948. Two states, one Israeli and one for Arabs, Palestinians. It just has never come to fruition. And for the longest time, even Israeli governments were supportive of a two-state solution. Netanyahu is not. And Trump obviously wants to carry the water for Netanyahu, so he's opposed to it as well. I still think it's the wrong idea. We should mention also that 75% of the member nations of the United Nations already recognize the Palestinian state. Now, they're not crazy about the government. It was the Palestinian people that elected Hamas, and that's a mistake, and that's been a real problem. But, that should not necessarily stop the United Nations, and especially Canada, from doing the right thing. You don't like the Hamas government. They're a terrorist organization. They're heinous people. But nonetheless, do you punish the Palestinian people for that? Well, some people are obviously doing that. Prime Minister Carney had mentioned that the reason why they were moving so rapidly towards this right now is he said this is the right time. They're running out of time to try to establish this. And I can kind of see his point. I mean, if you watch any of the media coverage of what's going on in Gaza, this in another couple of weeks, if this continues, there's only going to be rubble on the ground anyway. There's not going to be any Palestinian people, let alone Palestinian states. If you've seen the hundreds of thousands of people that are lining up and just whatever they can slip onto their cart and getting the hell away from the war zone and the bombings, I don't know where they're going. I don't know where they're going to get back. But the idea of having a prosperous state and solid government is a long shot at this stage. We all understand that. And Prime Minister Carney was quite clear on that. He has no illusions that it's going to, happen tomorrow. There's an awful lot of work that needs to be done, but the part of that has to be the recognition and the support that they need at this stage. And, of course, free elections that do not include Hamas. Those conditions are still in play. And it's going to be interesting, and I'll be watching with great interest, as we all will, to see just how that rolls out over the next little while. How can you have free elections? How can you have any elections in that area right now when you see the devastation that's going on and the carnage and the people that are being killed and displaced? Nobody's going to go vote. There's nowhere to go vote for that matter. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, but that shouldn't stop us from doing the right thing, nor should the idea of a threat of tariffs. Some of the Republicans south of the border have said that Canada did the wrong thing, and Trump mentioned that during his speech at the UN as well. And there may be the threat of the imposition of even deeper tariffs to Canada and some of the other member nations that supported this. And I'm concerned about that. Of course we are. We see the impact it's having on our economy. But should that stop us from doing the right thing? Are we a nation right now that's simply going to say, well, we better check with Donald Trump to see if he's okay with us doing this before we go ahead, whether it's this or anything else? God help us. If that's what we're going to do, we may as well be the 51st state if we have to look for his blessing on things that are going on. Canada has to stand on its own 2 feet as a sovereign nation, and that means economically and that means politically. And I think Prime Minister Carney is attempting to do that, and it's going to ruffle some feathers sometimes. It's going to ruffle some feathers in Washington when Canada strengthens economic ties with other countries. There was a meeting between Prime Minister Carney and the president of China to talk about some of the tariff situations, the canola situation, Chinese EVs. I don't know that anything's got resolved, but those communication lines are open right now. Strengthening ties with the European Union, with Germany. That's going to happen. And the United States is going to wake up pretty soon and realize, hey, wait a second, Canada's not as reliant as they used to be with us. And that might piss them off a little bit, probably more than a little bit. But that shouldn't stop us from doing what we think is the right thing. And by the way, on that very issue, one of the things that came up, of course, was the idea that the Ukraine situation that, these member nations that want to see an end of the war are going to have to stop buying Russian oil. And I agree with that. That makes all kinds of sense. Trump agrees with that, which means they're going to have to find their oil from someplace else. Well, that fits right into what Prime Minister Carney was talking about opportunities during all these tragic situations and what's going on in Ukraine. That's an opportunity here, and I think it underscores Canada's ability to be able to fill some of that void. We've talked about LNG and moving our goods to other markets. We all still remember, of course, the German Chancellor talking to Prime Minister Trudeau back in those days about trying to get an LNG pipeline, I mean that figuratively, not literally, over to Europe and to Germany so that they wouldn't be so reliant on Russian fuels and oils. Trudeau said, no, I'm not even going to try that. Prime Minister Carney is not taking that tact at all. So there's an opportunity there for Canadians to fill part of that void anyway, which would be mutually beneficial to both us and, of course, to those European nations, as it will to Asian nations and others as well. Less reliance on Russian product is what we're shooting for, and not just Canada, but I think with the United Nations, with the G7, G20, it's a long-term goal, and Canada can and should play a larger role in that. And there's an opportunity here, as Prime Minister Carney talked about. And on that point, by the way, just to wrap up, we talked about Carney's address to the General Assembly, that he had to work, of course, with a number of other subcommittees, including an economic summit on the last day, where he was at the head table with a number of the other presenters. And I found it interesting as he outlined Canada's plan for economic growth in the future, and also dovetailing into what other United Nations countries and G7 nations can do following this plan and the three-step process that he talked about. And I was interested to watch all the other members in the economic summit from other nations, European, Asian, etc., nodding in agreement as Carney is outlining these points. In other words, they're agreeing that, yeah, that's the way to go. This is what we should be doing. And that level of acceptance and that level of trust, I guess, in our prime minister was gratifying. It's not just national pride that says that. It kind of shows that, hey, we've got somebody in charge here making the calls who understands what's going on and knows what needs to be done. That hasn't always been the case with our Canadian leaders. So we need to have that as a takeaway from the UN General Assembly in the last couple of days in New York City, too. As I say, the foundation has been laid. The question now is, well, where's the call to action and exactly how do we get the ball rolling here? And that's going to be somewhat of a challenge. But I'm confident that the government knows what they need to do. Now all we need to do is move our parliament when they get back to work about what they need to do to try to make this work as well. And we will be watching on both sides of the House. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. Don't forget, hit that notification bell if you're on YouTube. And thank you for the subscriptions. We have lots of time and lots of key elements that we want to talk about here. And your support through subscriptions can really help us to continue that work here on the podcast. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.